There was a time when a screenshot could sell you a game. You saw it in a magazine, you read the preview, and before you ever touched the controller, you already knew the game was going to change everything. That game might have been Rise of the Robots, it might have been Daikatana. Whatever it was, long before you played it, you had already built the perfect version of it in your head. So when the moment of truth finally came, and you realized firsthand just how bad that game was, it wasn't just disappointing. It felt personal. Because the game you wanted was never the game you were actually sold. Most of us who have lived through that have made peace with the experience. We tell ourselves we overhyped it. We were young, we read too much into the previews, we let ourselves believe too hard. And there's something comforting about that explanation because it puts the mistake in our hands. But remember, the expectations didn't just come from nowhere. They came from a system that got very good at one specific thing, selling you the parts of a game you could see before you could test the parts that mattered. Screenshots, a famous name on the box, a techie buzzword in a preview. All of it made a game feel real before you had any way of knowing whether it was actually fun to play. And the industry learned, maybe not through conspiracy, but more like through incentive, that the parts of a game you could photograph were much easier to sell than the parts you actually played. Which is why the games that actually lived up to the hype felt so different. They didn't ask you to trust the promise. They let you test it for yourself. Here's what it felt like when hype actually delivered. In 1996, Nintendo shipped Super Mario 64 alongside the Nintendo 64. When you picked up the controller, within about 30 seconds, you understood why people were excited. No one had to explain it to you. The way Mario first moved through the courtyard of Peach's castle was like nothing you had ever experienced before. And that's what Nintendo was selling. Movement. And movement was the first thing you felt. That wasn't an accident. In a 1996 interview, Shigeru Miyamoto said the team spent roughly half its development time on the movement, animation, and physics system before building anything else around it. They didn't build the marketing first and then hope the game could live up to it later. They built the thing players were going to feel before they built the rest of the experience around it. In November 2001, the original Xbox launched with a much more specific promise. Halo, a first-person shooter that would finally feel right on a console. Because at the time, most console shooters still felt awkward. Aiming with a controller was slow, it was stiff, and never quite felt natural. Ed Fries, who ran Microsoft Game Studios at the time, later put it very plainly. He said, "I think Halo was the first game to make an FPS feel good on a console. Today we take dual-stick controls for granted on consoles, but in the year 2001, it was something incredibly new. The difference is always obvious. Now, of course, Mario 64 and Halo were great games. They lived up to the hype. But the first things those games asked you to believe was also the first thing they delivered. But for some games, the promise ends as soon as you press start." So, back to Rise of the Robots. The graphics really were impressive. The robots were made in 3D Studio. Some took months to render. And that is what the marketing sold. Motion capture, smarter AI, a fighting game that was supposed to make Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat look outdated. And then the game came out. Jonathan Davies, a reviewer for Amiga Power, who got the game just days before it went on sale, came to a conclusion that gets right to the heart of the problem. He wrote, "It's probably because the graphics are good that the game plays so poorly. Every move the robots make takes so many frames of animation and so much memory and so many months of rendering with 3D Studio that it simply wouldn't have been possible to make the gameplay any more complicated than it is. There you have it. The graphics were not just part of the problem, they were the problem. The team had put so much into how the game looked that there wasn't much left for how it played. Now, if Rise of the Robots sold you something you could see, Fable sold you something you could imagine. The promises for this game were not vague. They were very specific, detailed enough to feel real. Peter Molyneux described features players could picture right away. You could have children. Your character would grow older over the course of the game. You could knock an acorn out of a tree and then come back later and watch it grow into an oak. You could picture all of this, but you had no way of knowing if it would actually be in the game. So when Fable came out in 2004, many of those features were gone. Molyneux later apologized on Lionhead's forum. He said the features he'd talked about had been in development, but not all of them made it into the final game. Years later, he looked back on the Acorn promise specifically, and he told Kotaku, I quote, "That one line then changed people's perceptions of me, because I became someone who promised acorns that didn't grow into trees." It's true, Molyneux promised too much, but we as players naturally filled in the rest. The promises were real enough to get excited about, and that was the problem. It gave people a version of Fable they wanted. The real game could never compete with that version. So if Rise of the Robots asked you to trust a screenshot and Fable asked you to trust a promise, then Duke Nukem Forever? Well, it asked you to trust 14 years of your own imagination. The game was announced in April of 1997. It was supposed to come out in 1998. It finally released in June 2011. That's 14 years later, long enough to earn a Guinness World Record for the longest development time of any video game. Now, during that time, the game changed engines multiple times. It moved from Quake 2 technology to Unreal, and then it changed again. Every delay made the game bigger in people's minds. By the time Duke Nukem Forever came out, people were not comparing it to other games. They were comparing it to 14 years of waiting. The game scored between 49 and 54 on Metacritic, depending on the platform. But critics called out the dated design, the clunky controls, and the humor, which felt like it was stuck in 1996. I wonder why. But those problems would have just been ordinary disappointments for a game nobody had waited for. But this was different. For 14 years, players had been making room in their heads for the game they hoped it would become. The wait itself had become the product, and no finished game could ever compete with that. The interesting thing is that we still remember games like Rise of the Robots, and it's not because we're still playing them. It's not because they were great games, far from it. But we remember the ads, we remember the screenshots, we remember how so many of these games looked like the future. And I think that's why they stay with us. A bad game usually just disappears. But when a game makes you believe it's going to change everything, the disappointment sticks. You don't just remember the game, you remember the feeling, the anticipation of what it would be like to finally play it for the first time. You remember what you thought it was going to be. And it's fascinating that that feeling can stay with you longer than actually playing the game itself. So, in conclusion, I think it's safe to say that the games that disappointed us the most weren't always the worst games. They were the ones that made us fall in love before we knew what we were actually getting. The more a game asks you to imagine before you can play it, the more dangerous the hype becomes, because the version you imagine in your head is always built to fit you perfectly. Bad games give you less than what you imagine, and the great ones, well, they give you more. So now I'm interested to hear from you. What game made you believe in it the most, and then let you down the hardest? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you made it this far, as always, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, happy gaming, my friends.